Welcome to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer, bringing you tips, tricks, and techniques to help you get the most from your time on the water. Here's acclaimed fly fishing author and lifelong fly fishing enthusiast, Tom Rosenbauer.
Welcome to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast. This week, let's talk about beetles and bugs and ants and grasshoppers, what fly rodders refer to as terrestrial insects. It's timely because a lot of the mayfly and caddis fly hatches are dwindling, especially in the eastern United States, but also in the western United States on some rivers. And the fish have to eat something. There isn't much going on the bottom of the river, and there isn't much hatching later in the summer, but there's a lot of stuff falling in. And besides sticks and leaves and pieces of grass, there are ants and beetles and grasshoppers and crickets and leafhoppers and bees and wasps and a host of other moths, a host of other terrestrial insects that fall in the water. And the fish love to eat these things. And there's a couple things that happen at this time of year. The current's slower and the water's lower and clearer, so fish are both able to see these things falling in a lot easier than they would in the high water of spring. And it's a lot easier for them to pluck stuff off the surface film because the current's slower and they don't have to work so hard to grab something off the top of the water. And the great thing about terrestrial fishing is it's almost entirely dry fly fishing. So it's a lot of fun, it's visual, and it can be quite easy. It's been reported in the scientific journals that the diet of trout in small streams, little tiny meadow and mountain streams, can be as much as high as 80% terrestrial insects during the summer. So that's the major part of their diet. So imitating these insects is important. You don't have to have a fancy terrestrial beetle or ant imitation necessarily. A lot of the flies that we just use as prospecting or attractor flies might look like a terrestrial insect to the trout. Things like humpies and parachute atoms are kind of big and bulky, and they might look like a beetle falling in the water. You say, well, a humpy has wings and a beetle doesn't have wings, but a beetle actually does have wings. Beetles fly. A lot of ants fly when they're migrating. Grasshoppers have wings. So even some of the winged flies that we might normally use to imitate caddis flies or mayflies can work as a terrestrial imitation. But it's kind of fun to imitate some of the terrestrial insects. It's a little more fun to fish a grasshopper fly or fish an ant or a beetle fly. It makes us think we're fooling the fish maybe more than we really are. So it makes us feel a little more clever when we use a terrestrial imitation. And probably very selective fish, and especially in fish in flat water, are a little bit more selective and may be looking for something that looks more like a terrestrial. So what are the most important ones? Ants. Trout seem to love ants. Ants come in sizes from about a size 12, a big black carpenter ant, down to teeny tiny ones that you can barely imitate. Best ants are usually in size 16 and 18. That seems to be the best size, and it imitates a lot of the common ants that fall in the water. One of the most important ant fishing situations is when you have a fall, or what some people call a hatch of flying ants. And certain ant colonies will sprout wings and fly away and migrate anytime from June through September, depending on what part of the country you are and what kind of ant you're dealing with. And for some reason, these ants, when they're flying, when they're migrating, are attracted to the surface of the water. Some scientists believe it's because of the polarized UV light off the surface of the water. These ants fall in the water, and fish go absolutely nuts over flying ants. I've never seen a situation like this in the middle of the summer. You won't see any situation like this other than a hatch of little tiny trico spinners, where nearly every trout in the river is on the surface eating these ants. And when that happens, you really do need a winged ant imitation or a flying ant imitation. If you don't have one, you're going to be in big trouble. The fish get selective. One of my favorites is a fly I developed a couple years ago called the General T. And I tried it to imitate a flying ant, but it also works, I think, to imitate house flies. A lot of house flies fall in the water, ants, wasps, any kind of winged fly that falls in the water. It's easy to see, and it's just a good basic pattern. Another very important insect, terrestrial insect, are beetles. If you do a sampling of insects along the banks of a river, you'll find a tremendous number of beetles and a tremendous variety of beetles. And trout absolutely love beetles almost as much as they love ants. When you fish these things, you don't have to worry exactly about what kind of beetles are falling in the water, because there'll be half a dozen at least different beetles along the banks of your favorite trout stream, and the trout will probably eat all of them. And so we typically try to imitate the bigger ones because the flies are easier to tie on and easier to see. So a size 14 or 16 beetle is a great fly all summer long, nearly anywhere in the country. And beetles actually are quite active as early as April and May. The fish don't seem to bother with them as much because there's other food around, but in the middle of the summer, beetles can be a very important part of the food supply. Grasshoppers are probably the third most important group of insects. Now, on a lot of rivers, the fish don't bother with grasshoppers. If there aren't a lot of grasshoppers around and the fish have other things, they may ignore them. I know a lot of, particularly eastern streams where there's hoppers along the bank, and the fish will occasionally take one, and you can catch one on a hopper, but it's not a terrific way to fish during the summer. However, in the western United States, where you have these vast expanses of hayfields and dry land and a lot of wind, hoppers are extremely important. It's a big morsel. It's a big piece of food, and the trout will go out of their way to grab a hopper. And you'd think that trout would take a hopper with a great big explosion, but often they've seen so many of them, they know the hoppers ride low in the water, that they can take a great big hopper with just barely a dimple. So when you fish a grasshopper, you need to watch very carefully because you won't always see a smashing strike. Another terrestrial insect that's probably going to be very important this summer is the cicada, and these are those great big kind of triangular-shaped bugs that get up in the top of the trees and make a really loud, annoying buzz later in the summer. And this is supposedly, at least in the eastern United States, the high point of their 17-year cycle. So it's going to be important on a lot of rivers all over the country to have a great big dry fly, a size 6 or an 8, because fish will move 6 or 8 feet for these things, and they'll actually compete for one when it falls in the water. It's a huge bundle of protein. Fish doesn't have to eat very many of them to get satisfied. So anywhere you're fishing this summer, make sure you have a couple of great big foam dry flies like a single malt cicada or a Chernobyl ant, something that's big and dark and has rubber legs and you can slap down in the water, because these bugs might become quite important in your favorite stream. Now, how do you fish terrestrials? Well, upstream, dead drift for the most part, just like anything else. Beetles and ants don't make much commotion on the water. The one exception are the bigger things like hoppers and cicadas, where you want to give them an occasional twitch. Sometimes the fish will take a fly that's twitching. Sometimes they won't take a fly that's twitching, so you have to try both. I usually like to start off dead drift with a grasshopper, and if I don't get any strikes, then maybe introduce a couple of twitches early in the drift by throwing a big mend or just raising the rod tip a little bit, and then letting the fly dead drift, and then another little twitch. And if all else fails, you can throw it out there and give it a series of steady twitches. But usually you want to be more subtle twitching the fly than you do. You don't want a real active retrieve when fishing the fly. Remember when you're fishing terrestrials that most of these land-bred insects don't get active till mid to late morning, and then they'll be more active during the afternoon. Particularly if the morning is cold or damp, they just stay along the bank and stay hidden under bushes and under leaves and things like that. And once the sun warms the banks of the river and warms the grass, the flies will become much more active. And, of course, when they're more active, they're going to make mistakes and fall into the water and fly into the water. So typically terrestrial insects, especially grasshoppers, don't really work well until 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning when the fish start seeing the naturals. And then they're good throughout the day then, as long as it stays warm. So remember to try these things, especially in the middle of the day. If you want some further information on fishing terrestrial insects, I'll give you a blatant plug for one of my latest books, The Orvis Pocket Guide to Terrestrial Fishing. If you don't want to spend the $12.95, that's all right. My son really doesn't need a new pair of shoes next year. We've got some free stuff on the Orvis website. If you go to orvis.com/beetle, which is my favorite terrestrial, you'll find an article there on terrestrial fishing. We've got all the flies that I mentioned also on the Orvis website. So have fun with terrestrials, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer. Since 1856, anglers worldwide have counted on Orvis to help them get the most from their time on the water. To learn more and to shop the world's finest fly fishing gear, including the award-winning zero-gravity Helios rod, visit www.orvis.com/podcast.